Imagine a family that shaped the destiny of Europe for 6.5 centuries. A dynasty whose marriages decided the outcome of wars and whose deaths changed the borders of countries. The Habsburgs created an empire over which the sun never set. But their history is not only one of triumphs and conquests. This is the story of how one Austrian family turned politics into an art form and dynastic alliances into a weapon for conquering the continent. Today, we will reveal the secrets of the most powerful royal dynasty in human history. The Habsburgs proved that clever diplomacy is sometimes more effective than military force. Their empire lasted longer than any other state in European history. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes about the great dynasties of the past. And in the comments, let's discuss the controversial question: were the dynastic marriages of the Habsburgs a brilliant strategy, or did they lead to the degeneration of Europe's ruling elites? In the dense forests of modern Switzerland, on a rocky hill above the Aare River, the ancient walls of a castle still stand, its name synonymous with power and authority in Europe. Habsburg, meaning Hawk's Castle, was built in 1010 by Count Radbot, founder of a dynasty that would go on to rule most of the European continent for 6.5 centuries. No one could have imagined that the descendants of this middle-ranking Swiss nobleman would become the most influential royal family in human history. Their empire would stretch from the shores of the North Sea to the African deserts, from the American jungles to the Asian steppes. The sun would truly never set on their possessions. The history of the Habsburgs is a chronicle of an unprecedented rise to power, where every marriage became a political alliance, every birth a strategic advantage, and every death a reason to redraw the map of Europe. This is the story of how one family turned dynastic marriages into an art form, creating an invisible network of family ties that entangled the entire continent. The first Habsburgs were typical representatives of the feudal nobility, warriors, landowners, and participants in endless internecine strife. Count Rudolf and his descendants slowly expanded their holdings over 2 centuries, acquiring lands in Alsace, Swabia, and Austria. They served the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, participated in the Crusades, and entered into advantageous marriages with neighboring dynasties. A key figure in the early period was Count Rudolf IV of Habsburg, who lived in the 13th century. It was he who laid the foundations for the future power of the dynasty, demonstrating extraordinary political abilities and military talents. Rudolf understood that in an era of feudal fragmentation, only those who knew how to maneuver between different forces, conclude necessary alliances, and strike a decisive blow at the right moment could survive. The Holy Roman Empire at that time was a patchwork quilt of hundreds of independent principalities, duchies, counties, and free cities. The imperial title was not inherited but elected by a college of electors, the 7 most influential rulers of the empire. This created unique opportunities for ambitious dynasties willing to play the complex game of high politics. The 27th of September, 1273 was a turning point not only for the Habsburg dynasty, but for the entire history of Europe. On that day, 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire gathered in Frankfurt am Main to elect a new emperor. Their choice fell on the 55-year-old Count Rudolf of Habsburg, a decision that seemed like a compromise at the time, but turned out to be fateful. Rudolf was not an obvious candidate for the imperial throne. More influential princes, King Ottokar II of Bohemia, the Duke of Bavaria, and the Margrave of Brandenburg, had more land, troops, and wealth. But it was precisely in this mediocrity that the electors saw an advantage. They were tired of strong emperors who limited their power and threatened their independence. Rudolf seemed like a manageable candidate who would not claim absolute power. How wrong they were! The new emperor Rudolf I immediately demonstrated that behind his modest appearance lay an iron will and a brilliant political mind. His first task was to subdue Otakar II Przemysl, king of Bohemia, who refused to recognize Rudolf's election and continued to expand his possessions in Austria and Styria. The conflict with Otakar became the first serious test for the young Habsburg imperial power. The Bohemian king was a formidable opponent, an experienced warrior, a talented politician, and the ruler of one of the richest kingdoms in Europe. His armies controlled the most important trade routes between the north and south, and the gold from the Bohemian mines allowed him to maintain a powerful military machine. Rudolf proved himself a master of diplomacy and strategy. Instead of direct military confrontation, he began to methodically isolate Otakar, forming alliances with his enemies and rivals. The King of Hungary, Ladislaus IV, Polish princes, and even some Bohemian aristocrats were drawn to the emperor's side with promises of land and privileges. The decisive battle took place on August 26, 1278, at Dürnkreuz in Austria. It was one of the largest battles of the 13th century, with two huge armies clashing in a deadly battle for the future of Central Europe. Rudolf personally commanded the troops, demonstrating not only his strategic abilities, but also his personal bravery. The victory was complete. Ottokar fell in battle, and his army was routed. But Rudolf's true genius lay not in his military victory, but in its political consequences. Instead of annexing the conquered lands to the imperial possessions, he transferred Austria and Styria to the hereditary possession of his sons, Albrecht and Rudolf. This step laid the foundations for the future power of the dynasty. The Habsburgs gained their own hereditary power base, independent of the whims of the electors. Austria est imperare orbi universo. Austria is destined to rule the world. These Latin words, which became the motto of the Habsburg dynasty, were first uttered by Emperor Frederick III in the 15th century. Contemporaries considered them a manifestation of the megalomania of a weak ruler, but history proved the prophetic nature of this statement. Frederick III ruled longer than any other emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, 53 years, from 1442 to 1493. His reign was filled with crises, military defeats, and territorial losses, but it was Frederick who laid the ideological and dynastic foundations for the future greatness of the Habsburgs. The emperor was a deeply religious man who sincerely believed in the divine nature of his power. He spent hours in prayer, studied astrology and alchemy, and sought mystical signs confirming the special mission of his dynasty. His contemporaries mocked the dreamer emperor, but Frederick methodically implemented a grand plan to transform Austria into the center of European politics. Dynastic marriages became a key instrument of this plan. Frederick understood that military power had its limits, but that well-constructed family ties could bring power over vast territories without a single battle. He began to develop a complex matrix of marriage alliances that would entangle Europe in an invisible web of Habsburg influence. The first masterpiece of this policy was the marriage of Frederick's son, Archduke Maximilian, to Mary of Burgundy in 1477. Burgundy was one of the richest states in Europe, controlling the lucrative trade between the north and south of the continent. Maximilian's marriage brought the Habsburgs not only enormous wealth, but also strategically important territories in the Netherlands and Franche-Comté. Mary of Burgundy was not just a beautiful bride. She was the last representative of the Valois-Burgundy dynasty, and her death in 1482 in a hunting accident made Maximilian the ruler of some of the most developed lands in Europe. The French king Louis XI attempted to seize the Burgundian inheritance by force, but the Habsburgs managed to defend their rights, laying the foundations for centuries of enmity between the two dynasties. Frederick III was also the first emperor to systematically use symbols and ceremonial aspects of power to strengthen the prestige of his dynasty. He commissioned luxurious portraits, built magnificent palaces, and developed elaborate court rituals. The famous motto AEIOU appeared everywhere, on buildings, documents, and works of art, becoming a kind of brand for Habsburg power. But Frederick's most important legacy was the ideology of universal monarchy. He was the first to formulate the concept of the Habsburgs as a dynasty destined to unite the Christian world under a single authority. This idea would become the driving force behind the policies of his successors for the next 3 centuries. Maximilian I went down in history under the romantic nickname the Last Knight, but in reality, he was the first modern politician of his era. Ruling from 1493 to 1519, this emperor turned dynastic marriages into a precise science, laying the foundations for an empire over which the sun truly never set. Maximilian inherited not only the imperial title from his father, but also his grandiose ambitions. However, unlike Frederick III, who preferred dreams to real action, the new emperor possessed the energy and practicality necessary to bring the Habsburg plans to life. He understood that in an era of nation-building, the old methods of feudal politics no longer worked. The central element of Maximilian's strategy was the creation of a system of marriage diplomacy that surpassed in complexity and effectiveness everything that European politics had known before. Each marriage was planned like a military operation, and each child was seen as a potential tool for dynastic expansion. The famous Latin saying, "Bella gerant ali, tu felix Austria nub," "Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry," accurately reflected the essence of this policy. The first triumph of the new strategy was the double marriage of Maximilian's children to the children of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1497. Archduke Philip the Handsome married Infanta Joanna of Castile, and Archduchess Margaret became the wife of Infante John of Aragon. These marriages seemed like ordinary dynastic alliances, but a chain of tragic deaths turned them into the key to the Spanish throne. Infante Juan died in 1497, a few months after his wedding. His older sister Isabella, who had married a Portuguese prince, died in childbirth in 1498. Her son Miguel, who could have united Spain and Portugal under his rule, died at the age of 2. Thus, the youngest daughter of the Catholic monarchs, wife of Philip the Handsome, unexpectedly became the heir to the vast Spanish monarchy. But fate had an even more incredible gift in store for the Habsburgs. In 1504, Philip the Handsome died, leaving behind his mentally unstable wife Joanna, who was nicknamed the Mad. Maximilian himself became regent to their young son Charles, gaining control over the Spanish possessions, including the overseas colonies in America. At the same time, the emperor continued to expand Habsburg influence in Eastern Europe. The Hungarian Treaty of 1515 provided for mutual succession between the Habsburgs and the Jagiellonian dynasty. When King Louis II died in the Battle of Mohacs against the Turks in 1526, the crown of Hungary and Bohemia passed to Charles's younger brother, Archduke Ferdinand. Maximilian was also an innovator in the field of propaganda and information policy. He actively used a new invention, the printing press, to spread Habsburg ideology. Luxurious illustrated books glorifying the deeds of the dynasty were commissioned, medals with imperial portraits were minted, and triumphal arches were built for ceremonial entries into cities. When the 19-year-old Charles V ascended the throne in 1519, no one could have imagined that this young man would become the ruler of the largest empire in human history. The grandson of Maximilian I inherited the results of 3 centuries of Habsburg marriage diplomacy. Territories stretching from Peru to the Philippines, from Naples to the Netherlands. The scale of the young emperor's possessions was truly dizzying. As King of Spain under the name Charles I, he controlled the Iberian Peninsula, Sicily, Sardinia, Naples, and vast American colonies. As Archduke of Austria, he owned the hereditary Habsburg lands in the Alps. As Duke of Burgundy, he owned the rich Netherlands and Franche-Comté. And his election as Holy Roman Emperor in 1519 made him the nominal suzerain of all Germany. Contemporaries called Charles's empire a power over which the sun never sets. And this was not a poetic metaphor, but a geographical reality. While the sun was setting in Mexico, it was rising over the Philippines. While night was falling in the Netherlands, day was beginning in Peru. Never before in history had one man controlled such vast territories. But the size of the empire also created enormous problems. Charlemagne spent his reign traveling constantly, trying to personally manage his scattered possessions around the world. During his 40 years of rule, he made 10 trips to Germany, 7 to Spain, 6 to Italy, and 4 to France. His contemporaries estimated that the emperor spent about a third of his life on the road. Charles's main enemy was the French king Francis I, who could not come to terms with the Habsburg encirclement of France. The Italian Wars of 1520 to 1559 turned into a global conflict between the 2 greatest monarchs of the era. The Battle of Pavia on February 24, 1525, where Francis was taken prisoner, seemed to decide the outcome of the confrontation in favor of the Habsburgs. But Charles faced a more serious threat in the east. The Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, had reached the height of its power and threatened the very heart of Christian Europe. In 1529, Turkish troops reached the walls of Vienna, and only the heroic defense of the city saved the Habsburg possessions from disaster. The religious schism initiated by Martin Luther in 1517 created additional problems for the emperor. As a defender of the Catholic faith, Charles was obliged to fight Protestant heresy, but political interests often forced him to seek compromises with the German Lutheran princes. The Schmalkaldic Wars of 1546 to 1555 showed the limits of imperial power in religious matters. By the middle of the 15th century, Charles realized that it was impossible to rule such a vast empire alone. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which recognized the right of German princes to choose the religion of their subjects, became a symbol of the collapse of the dream of a unified Christian empire under the Habsburg scepter. Charles V's decision to divide his empire in 1556 was one of the most dramatic moments in the history of the Habsburg dynasty. Exhausted by 40 years of rule, constant wars, and insoluble contradictions between the various parts of his possessions, the great emperor took an unprecedented decision to voluntarily abdicate the throne and divide the empire between two branches of his family. The abdication ceremony, which took place on October 25, 1556, in Brussels, shocked his contemporaries. The most powerful monarch in the Christian world, a man who could decide the fate of millions with a stroke of his pen, publicly admitted his inability to cope with the responsibilities entrusted to him. Charles transferred the Spanish possessions, including the American colonies and Italian territories, to his son Philip, and the Austrian lands and the imperial title to his younger brother Ferdinand. This decision had far-reaching consequences for the entire European political landscape. For the first time in 2.5 centuries, the Habsburg monarchy ceased to be a unified whole. Two independent branches of the dynasty emerged, the Spanish and Austrian branches, which, while remaining related and allied, pursued different interests and conducted independent policies. Philip II, who became King of Spain, inherited the richest part of his father's empire. American silver provided him with virtually unlimited financial resources, enabling him to maintain the most powerful army in Europe and a fleet that ruled the seas. Spanish possessions included not only the Iberian Peninsula, but also Naples, Sicily, Milan, the Netherlands, Franche-Comté, and vast American colonies stretching from Mexico to Chile. The new Spanish king was the complete opposite of his father. While Charles V was a cosmopolitan who felt equally at home in Toledo and Vienna, Antwerp and Naples, Philip became a typical Spanish monarch. He rarely left the Iberian Peninsula, preferring to rule his empire from his gloomy palace at El Escorial, built in memory of the victory at San Quintin. Ferdinand I, who became emperor and founder of the Austrian branch of the Habsburg dynasty, received less wealthy but strategically important territories. Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary formed a compact block of possessions in the heart of Europe, which became the stronghold of Habsburg power for the next 3.5 centuries. The main task of the Austrian branch was to defend Christian Europe from Ottoman expansion. The division of the empire did not mean a break between the two branches of the dynasty. Both lines of the Habsburgs continued to consider themselves one family, united by common interests and common enemies. Marriages between Austrian and Spanish princes and princesses strengthened family ties, and coordination of foreign policy allowed them to effectively counter the French threat. Cooperation in the religious sphere was particularly close. Both branches of the dynasty remained zealous Catholics and active participants in the Counter-Reformation. The Spanish Inquisition and the Austrian Jesuits acted as a united force aimed at eradicating Protestant heresy and strengthening papal power. The Council of Trent, held from 1545 to 1563, was actively supported by both Habsburg monarchies. Ferdinand I faced a task that could have broken any ruler: to stop Ottoman expansion in the heart of Europe. When he became emperor in 1556, Turkish troops controlled most of Hungary. Their fortresses stood only 150 kilometers from Vienna, and Ottoman raids ravaged Austria, Moravia, and Silesia. The Battle of Mohacs on August 29, 1526, was a national disaster for Hungary. King Louis II was killed along with the cream of the Hungarian nobility, and Turkish troops occupied Buda unopposed. Most of the country fell under Ottoman rule, and only a narrow strip of northern and western regions remained under Habsburg control. Ferdinand understood that traditional methods of warfare were not suitable for fighting the Ottoman military machine. The Turkish army surpassed European troops not only in numbers, but also in organization. The Janissary Corps was the first regular infantry in history, armed with firearms and operating under a single code of conduct. Turkish artillery was the best in the world, and its engineering units were skilled at capturing fortresses that were considered impregnable. The new emperor began to create a defensive system that was supposed to stop the further advance of the Ottomans to the west. A chain of fortresses stretching from the Adriatic Sea to the Baltic Sea was called the military frontier, a unique military administrative institution that existed for more than 3 centuries. The system was based on military settlements, where every man was both a soldier and a peasant. In peacetime, the settlers worked the land and supported their families. But in the event of a Turkish invasion, they became a regular army. For their service, they received land, tax exemptions, and the right to self-government. This system allowed the Habsburgs to maintain a standing army of 50,000 men without excessive strain on the state budget. The key figure in the defense was the Croatian ban Nikola Šubić Zrinski, who turned the city of Sigetvar into an impregnable fortress. The heroic defense of Sigetvar in 1566, when a small garrison under Zrinski's command held back Sultan Suleiman, the magnificent's army of 100,000 for a month, became a symbol of Christian resistance to Ottoman expansion. Suleiman's death at the walls of Sigetvar marked the end of the era of the great Ottoman conquests. His successors no longer possessed the military genius of the dynasty's founder, and the empire's internal problems were becoming increasingly serious. Ferdinand managed to stabilize the situation on the eastern border, and even began a slow reconquest of Hungarian territories. Successes in the fight against the Turks allowed the emperor to focus on internal reforms. He carried out an administrative reorganization of the Austrian lands, created a unified judicial system, and streamlined taxation. Ferdinand paid particular attention to the development of trade and crafts, understanding that only an economically strong state could withstand external threats. Ferdinand's religious policy was relatively tolerant. Unlike his nephew Philip II, who brutally persecuted Protestants in the Netherlands, the Austrian emperor preferred compromise. The Augsburg religious peace of 1555, concluded under Charles V, was confirmed and expanded. Rudolf II, who ruled from 1576 to 1612, became the most enigmatic figure in the history of the Habsburg dynasty. His contemporaries called him the Mystic Emperor, and his court in Prague became the center of European alchemy, astrology, and the occult sciences. Behind the facade of scholarly pursuits lay serious political problems that nearly led to the collapse of the Habsburg monarchy. Rudolf's court in Prague was unlike anything Europe had ever seen before. The emperor gathered around him outstanding scientists, artists, alchemists, and astrologers from all over the continent. Tycho Brahe conducted astronomical observations at the Imperial Observatory, Johannes Kepler calculated the orbits of the planets, and dozens of alchemists attempted to obtain the Philosopher's Stone in the laboratories of Prague Castle. Rudolf sincerely believed in the possibility of turning metals into gold and creating an elixir of immortality. He spent huge sums on alchemical experiments, bought rare ingredients from all over the world, and maintained an entire army of mystics and charlatans. The imperial collection of curiosities included thousands of items, from stuffed exotic animals to supposedly magical artifacts. But behind the emperor's mystical pursuits lay serious mental health issues. Rudolf suffered from bouts of melancholy, which modern historians diagnose as severe depression. He would spend months without leaving his chambers, refusing to receive ambassadors and ignoring state affairs. The administration of the empire effectively passed into the hands of the court clique and provincial governors. The religious situation in the empire became increasingly tense. The Counter-Reformation, begun by Rudolf's predecessors, led to a sharp escalation of conflicts between Catholics and Protestants. In Bohemia, where Protestants made up the majority of the population, dissatisfaction with imperial policy grew with each passing year. The nobility demanded guarantees of religious freedom and expanded political rights. Rudolf's attempt to forcibly convert Protestants to Catholicism led to an open rebellion. In 1528, the Bohemian estates forced the emperor to sign the Letter of Majesty, which guaranteed religious freedom throughout the kingdom. This document became one of the first acts of religious tolerance in European history. The foreign policy situation of the monarchy also deteriorated. The war with the Ottoman Empire resumed, known as the Long Turkish War, from 1593 to 1604. Despite some successes by the Habsburg army, the overall outcome of the conflict was disappointing. Austria was unable to regain most of its Hungarian territories. The emperor's family problems exacerbated the political crisis. Rudolf never married and left no legitimate heirs. His younger brother, Archduke Matthias, with the support of other members of the family, began a struggle for power, effectively removing the ailing emperor from the government. In 1509, Matthias forced Rudolf to cede Hungary, Austria, and Moravia to him, leaving his older brother with only Bohemia and the imperial title. This division weakened the Habsburg monarchy on the eve of one of the most serious crises in its history. Rudolf's death on January 20, 1612, ended one of the strangest eras in the history of the Habsburgs. His reign demonstrated both the greatness of a dynasty that had gathered the best minds of Europe at its court and its vulnerability in the face of internal contradictions and external threats. The 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648 was the most serious test in the history of the Habsburg dynasty. What began as a local religious conflict in Bohemia turned into a pan-European catastrophe that threatened the very existence of the Habsburg monarchy. The war revealed the limits of the dynasty's imperial ambitions and forced it to radically rethink its goals and methods. The spark that ignited the continent was the defenestration of Prague on May 23, 1618. Bohemian Protestant nobles, outraged by Emperor Matthias's violation of religious guarantees, stormed Prague Castle and threw 3 representatives of the imperial administration out of a window. This symbolic act opened a long series of conflicts that devastated Central Europe. The new emperor, Ferdinand II, who ascended the throne in 1519, was a devout Catholic educated by the Jesuits. He viewed the Bohemian uprising not simply as a political rebellion, but as religious heresy that must be eradicated by any means necessary. His motto became, "Better to rule a desert than a country of heretics." The Battle of White Mountain on November 8, 1620, decided the fate of Bohemia. The Catholic League, led by Bavarian General Tilly, totally crushed the Protestant troops of the Czech King Frederick V, Elector Palatine. The victory allowed Ferdinand to start a brutal crackdown on the Bohemian nobility. 27 leaders of the uprising were publicly executed in Old Town Square in Prague. But the suppression of the Bohemian rebellion did not bring peace. The Protestant states of Germany, supported by Denmark, Sweden, and France, united against Habsburg domination. The war took on an international character, turning into a struggle for the balance of power in Europe. Initially, success favored the imperial troops. Albrecht von Wallenstein, a brilliant commander and organizer, created a powerful mercenary army that won a series of brilliant victories over its Protestant opponents. By 1628, the imperial troops had reached the shores of the Baltic Sea, and it seemed that the dream of a unified Catholic empire was close to realization. However, the intervention of the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus radically changed the course of the war. The Snow King brought to Germany a revolutionary military system based on mobility, firepower, and iron discipline. The Battle of Breitenfeld on September 17, 1631, was a triumph for Swedish arms and marked the beginning of a series of defeats for the imperial troops. The death of Wallenstein in 1634, killed on the orders of the emperor on suspicion of treason, deprived the Habsburgs of their best commander. The war turned into a protracted conflict of attrition, in which all sides suffered enormous losses, but no one could achieve a decisive victory. French intervention in 1635 finally tipped the scales against the Habsburgs. Cardinal Richelieu, who led French policy, turned the religious war into a struggle against Habsburg hegemony in Europe. France, while remaining a Catholic country, supported the emperor's Protestant opponents, demonstrating that political interests were more important than religious principles. By the mid-1540s, the exhaustion of all parties to the conflict was evident. Germany lay in ruins, its population reduced by a third, trade and crafts in decline. Even the victors understood that continuing the war threatened the complete collapse of European civilization. Leopold I ascended the throne in 1558, when the Habsburg monarchy was in a state of deep crisis. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 deprived the emperors of real power in Germany. The French captured Alsace and threatened the Rhine, and Ottoman aggression resumed in the east. The new ruler had to not only restore the dynasty's power, but also redefine its place in the changed European order. The first years of Leopold's reign were marked by the French threat. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had turned France into the dominant power on the continent and openly claimed European hegemony. The War of Devolution of 1667 to 1668 and the Dutch War of 1672 to 1678 demonstrated the aggressiveness of French policy and Louis's readiness to resolve disputes by military means. But the most serious test awaited Leopold in the east. In 1680, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha began preparations for a new campaign against Vienna. Despite internal problems, the Ottoman Empire retained its military power and sought to complete its conquest of Hungary by capturing the Austrian capital. The Second Siege of Vienna in the summer of 1683 was the culmination of centuries of confrontation between the Islamic East and the Christian West. A 200,000-strong Turkish army surrounded the city, which was defended by only 20,000 soldiers under the command of Count Rüdiger von Starhemberg. It seemed that the fall of the Austrian capital was inevitable, and with it, the collapse of the Habsburg monarchy. Leopold left Vienna before the siege began, but this was not a sign of cowardice. The emperor was feverishly gathering an allied army to break the blockade of the city. Pope Innocent XI played a key role in the creation of the Christian coalition, declaring a holy war against the infidels. The Austrian troops were joined by Polish, Bavarian, and Saxon regiments, as well as volunteers from all over Europe. The decisive battle took place on September 12, 1683. The Allied army, commanded by Polish King John Sobieski, suddenly appeared at Kahlenberg and dealt a crushing blow to the Turkish camp. The famous attack by the Polish winged cavalry routed the Ottoman troops, and the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa himself was forced to flee, leaving behind enormous spoils. The victory at Vienna was a turning point in relations between the Habsburgs and the Ottoman Empire. For the first time in a century and a half, the initiative passed to the Christian forces. Leopold did not miss the opportunity and began the systematic liberation of Hungary from Turkish rule. The imperial army, commanded by Duke Charles of Lorraine and Prince Eugene of Savoy, won a series of brilliant victories. Buda was recaptured in 1686 after 144 years of Turkish rule. The Battle of Zenta on September 12, 1697, completed the defeat of the Ottoman forces in Hungary. The Peace of Karlowitz on January 26, 1699, sealed the triumph of the Habsburg army. Austria gained all of Hungary except for Banat, Transylvania, and most of Slavonia. For the first time in its history, the Ottoman Empire was forced to cede European territories to a Christian state. Successes in the East allowed Leopold to intensify his policy in the West. The War of the Augsburg League from 1688 to 1697 showed the limits of French power. Despite his military successes, Louis XIV was unable to break the resistance of the European coalition and was forced to sign the Treaty of Ryswick, which returned some of Austria's lost territories. Leopold's domestic policy was aimed at centralizing government and strengthening the Catholic faith. The suppression of the rebellions of Imre Thököly and Ferenc Rákóczi in Hungary, although brutal, ensured the internal stability of the monarchy. At the same time, the emperor pursued a policy of cautious modernization, attracting foreign specialists to the country and encouraging the development of trade. By the end of Leopold's reign, the Habsburg monarchy had once again become a great European power. Territorial acquisitions in the East, military successes against the French and Ottomans, and internal reforms created a solid foundation for the further rise of the dynasty. The death of the emperor on May 5, 1705, ended the era of the restoration of Habsburg power. The death of the childless Charles II of Spain on November 1, 1701, brought Europe to the brink of a new major war. The last representative of the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty bequeathed the vast Spanish monarchy to the French Prince Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV. The prospect of France and Spain, with its American colonies, being united under the rule of the Bourbons, horrified the rest of Europe. Emperor Leopold I could not accept the loss of the Spanish inheritance, which he considered the rightful property of his dynasty. His son, Archduke Charles, the future Emperor Charles VI, had no less valid claims to the Spanish throne as a representative of the senior Habsburg line. The War of the Spanish Succession was the last attempt to recreate the great Habsburg Empire of Charles V. The conflict began in 1701 and immediately took on a pan-European character. A grand alliance uniting Austria, England, Holland, and most of the German principalities opposed a coalition of France, Spain, Bavaria, and several Italian states. The theaters of war stretched from Flanders to Italy, from the Pyrenees to the Danube. At first, success favored the Allies. The Duke of Marlborough won brilliant victories at Blenheim, Ramillies, and Audenarde, while Prince Eugene of Savoy defeated the French in northern Italy. Archduke Charles landed in Catalonia and was proclaimed King Charles III by part of the Spanish nobility. The decisive moment of the war came in 1711, when the unexpected death of Emperor Joseph I made Archduke Charles heir to the Austrian throne. The prospect of the restoration of Charles V's empire under the rule of one man alarmed even Austria's allies. England and Holland began secret negotiations with France for a separate peace. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 was a diplomatic defeat for the Habsburgs. Philip V retained the Spanish throne, renouncing his rights to the French crown. Austria received the Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, and Sardinia, but lost Spain with its American colonies, the main prize of the entire war. Charles VI, who became emperor in 1711, never came to terms with the loss of Spain. Throughout his reign, he bore the title of King of Spain and dreamed of revenge. This dream determined Austria's foreign policy for 25 years and led to several minor wars that depleted the resources of the monarchy. The War of the Polish Succession from 1733 to 1735 and the War of the Austrian Succession from 1741 to 1748 demonstrated the limitations of Austria's capabilities. France and Prussia systematically weakened the Habsburg monarchy, taking away its territories and allies. The main problem for Charles VI was the question of succession to the throne. The emperor had no sons and sought to ensure that power would pass to his eldest daughter, Maria Theresa. The Pragmatic Sanction of 1723, which recognized the rights of women to the Habsburg throne, was approved by all European powers, but its practical implementation was questionable. The death of Charles VI on October 20, 1740, ended the male line of the Austrian Habsburgs. The dynasty that had ruled the Holy Roman Empire for more than 3 centuries ceased to exist. The future of the Habsburg monarchy was in the hands of a 23-year-old archduchess who had to prove her right to the throne in the heat of a new European war. The loss of the Spanish inheritance meant the end of the Habsburg hegemony in Europe. The dynasty, which once controlled half the continent, was forced to focus on its hereditary lands in Central Europe. But it was this concentration of power that enabled the Habsburgs to create a compact and efficiently managed empire that lasted for another 2 centuries. Maria Theresa ascended the throne on October 20, 1740, at the most dramatic moment in Habsburg history. The young 23-year-old archduchess inherited not only the crown, but also many enemies who considered the change of power to be the right moment to finally divide the Habsburg monarchy. Her 40-year reign became an era of radical reforms and the transformation of a medieval empire into a modern European state. The first months of the new empress's reign were marked by an atmosphere of impending disaster. Prussian King Frederick II, using the death of Charles VI as a pretext, invaded the wealthy province of Silesia. At the same time, French troops occupied Bohemia, the Bavarian elector proclaimed himself emperor, and the Spanish and Sardinians attacked Austrian possessions in Italy. It seemed that the Habsburg monarchy was doomed to extinction. Maria Theresa demonstrated qualities that her contemporaries did not expect to see in a young woman. She had an iron will, political acumen, and an amazing ability to inspire people to great deeds. The famous scene in the Hungarian parliament when the empress, with a baby in her arms, addressed the Magyar magnates with the words, "Moriamur pro rege nostro Maria Theresa," "We will die for our Queen Maria Theresa," became a symbol of her, ability to find allies in the most hopeless situations. The War of the Austrian Succession from 1741 to 1748 required Maria Theresa to exert the maximum effort of the entire monarchy. She personally participated in the planning of military operations, negotiated with allies, and sought funds to maintain the army. Support from England and Holland, concerned about the growing power of France, allowed Austria to survive the unequal struggle. The Peace of Aachen in 1748 marked a partial defeat for the Habsburgs. Maria Theresa was forced to cede Silesia to Prussia and several Italian territories to other enemies. But the main goal was achieved. The Habsburg monarchy retained its independence and territorial integrity. Moreover, the Empress's husband, Francis I, was elected Holy Roman Emperor, although real power remained in the hands of his wife. The loss of Silesia was a personal tragedy and a political challenge for Maria Theresa. She never forgave Frederick II for this robbery and spent the rest of her life trying to get the province back. The diplomatic revolution of 1756, which led to an alliance between Austria and its traditional enemy, France, was a direct consequence of the Empress's desire for revenge. The 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763 was the last attempt to regain Silesia by military means. Despite the support of France and Russia, Austria was unable to break the resistance of the Prussian king. The Peace of Hubertusburg confirmed the loss of Silesia, but demonstrated the increased power of the Habsburg military machine. Maria Theresa's main achievement was internal reforms that transformed the Habsburg monarchy into a centralized modern state. Administrative reform created a unified bureaucratic system. Judicial reform ensured equality of citizens before the law, and military reform turned the Austrian army into one of the best in Europe. The Empress paid particular attention to education and culture. The founding of the Theresianum, the reform of universities, and the creation of a system of primary education laid the foundations for Austrian education. Vienna became one of the cultural centers of Europe, where Haydn and Mozart composed, and theater and the visual arts flourished. Maria Theresa's economic reforms were aimed at modernizing the backward agrarian economy. Restrictions on serfdom, encouragement of trade and crafts, and the construction of roads and canals contributed to economic growth. Although serfdom was not abolished, the position of the peasants improved significantly. The Napoleonic Wars marked the agony of the Holy Roman Empire and, at the same time, the beginning of a new phase in the history of the Habsburg dynasty. What seemed like the complete collapse of the old order turned out to be an opportunity for radical renewal and modernization of the Habsburg monarchy. Emperor Francis II, who ruled from 1792, was forced to endure humiliation and defeat before ultimately becoming one of the main architects of post-war Europe. The French Revolution of 1789 shook the foundations of the European order. The execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, Emperor Franz's aunt, turned the conflict between Austria and revolutionary France into a personal feud. The Habsburgs became a symbol of resistance to revolutionary ideas and led a coalition of European monarchs against the Jacobin contagion. The First Coalition Wars showed that traditional European armies were unprepared to face revolutionary France. Austrian troops, trained in the spirit of discipline and formal tactics of the 18th century, were unable to withstand the enthusiasm of French volunteers and the military genius of young Republican generals. The emergence of Napoleon Bonaparte changed the nature of the conflict. The Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797 demonstrated the military genius of the Corsican and the helplessness of the Austrian command. The Peace of Campo Formio cost the Habsburgs Belgium and Lombardy, but more importantly, it demonstrated the superiority of the new military system over the old. The Battle of Austerlitz on December 2, 1805, became the Battle of the Three Emperors and one of the most crushing defeats in Habsburg history. Napoleon defeated the combined Austrian and Russian forces, personally commanded by Emperor Franz and Russian Tsar Alexander I. The Peace of Pressburg deprived Austria of Venice, Tyrol, and access to the Adriatic Sea. But Napoleon dealt the most painful blow to the prestige of the dynasty. On August 6, 1806, Emperor Franz was forced to abdicate the Holy Roman Empire, which his ancestors had ruled for more than 4 centuries. The thousand-year empire of Charlemagne ceased to exist, and the Habsburgs lost the main symbol of their European supremacy. The creation of the Rhine Confederation under French protection finally drove the Habsburgs out of Germany. The Austrian emperor became just one of many European monarchs, although he retained extensive hereditary possessions. The proclamation of the Austrian Empire in 1804 was an attempt to compensate for the loss of the imperial title, but it could not restore its former influence. An attempt at revenge in 1809 ended in another disaster. The Battle of Wagram on July 5th to 6th was another triumph for Napoleon and led to the conclusion of the Treaty of Schönbrunn, under which Austria lost its access to the sea and was obliged to join the continental blockade of England. However, Franz II proved to be a more flexible politician than his predecessors. The marriage of his daughter, Archduchess Maria Louise, to Napoleon in 1810 temporarily turned the Habsburgs into allies of the French emperor. This dynastic union gave Austria the respite it needed to recover and carry out reforms. Napoleon's defeat in Russia opened up new opportunities for the Habsburgs. Franz cautiously joined the anti-French coalition only after Napoleon's defeat became apparent. The Battle of the Nations near Leipzig, on October 16th to 19th, 1813, was revenge for years of humiliation. The Congress of Vienna in 1814 to 1815 turned Chancellor Clemens von Metternich into the chief architect of post-war Europe. Austria not only regained most of its lost territories, but also became the guarantor of a new European order based on the principles of legitimacy and balance of power. Franz Joseph I ascended the throne on December 18, 1848, as an 18-year-old youth, when the Habsburg monarchy was in the midst of a profound crisis. The revolutionary wave sweeping across Europe threatened the very existence of the empire. The Hungarians declared independence, the Czechs demanded autonomy, and the Italians rebelled against Austrian rule. The young emperor had to either modernize the archaic empire or witness its collapse. The first 20 years of Franz Joseph's reign were marked by reaction and centralization. After suppressing the Hungarian Revolution with the help of Russian troops, the emperor attempted to transform the multinational monarchy into a unitary state with German as the language of administration and Catholicism as the state religion. The system of neo-absolutism introduced by Minister Alexander Bach was aimed at Germanizing all the peoples of the empire, but attempts at forced unification failed. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 revealed Austria's diplomatic isolation. By refusing to support Russia against its Western allies, but also by not joining the anti-Russian coalition, the Habsburg Empire lost the support of all the great powers. The defeat in the war with France and Piedmont in 1859 marked the beginning of the collapse of Austrian rule in Italy. The loss of Lombardy after the Battle of Solferino on June 24th and the need to cede Venice in 1866 marked the end of 3 centuries of Habsburg presence on the Apennine Peninsula. An even more painful blow was the defeat by Prussia in 1866, the Battle of Königgrätz on July 3rd, where Prussian troops defeated the Austrian army, finally excluded the Habsburgs from German affairs. The Peace of Prague ended the centuries-long rivalry between the two dynasties with the victory of the Hohenzollerns and the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. Exclusion from the German Confederation forced Franz Joseph to reconsider the foundations of his state policy. The Compromise of 1867 with the Hungarian elite transformed the Austrian Empire into the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. The Magyars gained broad autonomy and equal rights with the Germans in the administration of the empire. The dualistic system resolved the Hungarian question, but created new problems. The Slavic peoples, the Czechs, Poles, Croats, and Serbs, remained dissatisfied with their position and demanded equality with the Germans and Hungarians. Attempts to create a tripartite system with the inclusion of the Slavs as a third element were met with resistance from both the German and Hungarian elites. After 1867, Franz Joseph's foreign policy was aimed at finding new spheres of influence to replace the lost German and Italian positions. The occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1878 opened the road to Thessaloniki and made Austria-Hungary a Balkan power. But Balkan policy brought the empire into conflict with growing Slavic nationalism. Serbia, supported by Russia, claimed the role of unifier of the South Slavs and regarded the Austro-Hungarian Serbs and Croats as its potential subjects. The annexation of Bosnia in 1918 exacerbated the contradictions to the limit. The emperor's personal life was full of tragedies that left their mark on all his activities. The execution of his younger brother Maximilian in Mexico in 1867, the suicide of his only son, Crown Prince Rudolph, in 1889, and the murder of his wife, Empress Elizabeth, in 1898, turned the monarch into a living symbol of the empire's tragedy. By the beginning of the 20th century, Austria-Hungary was an anachronism in a rapidly changing world. A multi-ethnic empire based on dynastic loyalty could not withstand the forces of nationalism and democracy. Franz Joseph, who had ruled for more than 50 years, became a symbol of a bygone era, but could not find a way into the new age. The shots fired in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, were fatal not only for Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, but also for the entire Habsburg dynasty. The assassination of the heir to the throne by Serbian terrorist Gavrilo Princip gave Austria-Hungary a reason to finally resolve the Serbian question, but led to a world war that buried a 6-century-old empire. Franz Joseph, who was 84 years old, took his nephew's death as a personal tragedy and a political challenge. The emperor, who had already lost his brother, son, and wife, lost his last close relative capable of continuing the dynasty. But most importantly, the assassination in Sarajevo became a symbol of the empire's inability to cope with national contradictions. The July crisis of 1914 demonstrated the bankruptcy of Austro-Hungarian diplomacy. The ultimatum to Serbia, deliberately drafted to be unacceptable, was intended to lead to a local war and restore the empire's prestige. But the system of European alliances turned the Balkan conflict into a global catastrophe. The declaration of war on Serbia on July 28 was met with enthusiasm in the German and Hungarian regions of the monarchy, but with coldness among the Slavic peoples. The Czechs, Poles, and South Slavs saw the conflict not as a defense of imperial interests, but as a suppression of the Slavic aspirations for freedom. From the first days of the war, centrifugal forces emerged that would tear the empire apart from within. Military operations for Austria-Hungary were disastrous. The offensive against Serbia failed. The small Balkan country not only repelled all attacks, but also defeated the Austro-Hungarian troops. The Russian offensive in Galicia led to the loss of Lviv and a retreat to the Carpathians. Italy's entry into the war in 1915 opened a new front in the Alps. The empire was held together only by German support. German troops saved Austria-Hungary from total collapse in the fall of 1914. German generals effectively commanded the Austro-Hungarian army, and German loans financed military expenditures. The Habsburg monarchy became a satellite of the German Empire. The death of Franz Joseph on November 21, 1916, marked the end of an era. The last great Habsburg emperor took with him the remnants of dynastic prestige and imperial unity. His successor, Charles I, was a weak ruler, unable to cope with the growing crisis. The February Revolution in Russia and the withdrawal of the Eastern ally from the war did not save the situation. The American entry into the war in April 1917 finally tipped the scales against the Central Powers. National movements within the empire were activated under the influence of President Wilson's 14 points. Czech politicians, led by Tomáš Masaryk, established a national council in Paris and achieved recognition of an independent Czechoslovakia. Poles united around the idea of restoring the Polish state. The South Slavs prepared for the creation of Yugoslavia. Even the loyal Hungarians began to talk about complete independence. Emperor Karl's attempt to conclude a separate peace with the Entente failed due to German pressure and the territorial demands of the Allies. The Sykes Affair, secret negotiations through the French relatives of the Empress, only compromised the monarch and increased Germany's distrust. The military collapse in the fall of 1918 made the empire's collapse inevitable. Charles's October 14th manifesto on federalizing the monarchy was half a century too late. The empire's peoples no longer wanted reforms. They wanted independence. On November 11, 1918, Emperor Charles signed his abdication from public affairs without formally renouncing the throne. This was the last attempt to preserve the dynastic rights for future generations. On November 12th, the Austrian Republic was proclaimed in front of the Parliament building in Vienna. 650 years of Habsburg rule in Europe came to an end. The empire that once stretched from the Netherlands to Transylvania, from Milan to Krakow, disappeared from the map of the world. Independent nation-states emerged from its ruins, embodying the principle of self-determination of peoples, but bringing new conflicts and problems to Europe.